Welcome everyone here this evening to my two speakers here. I'm going to give you a brief bio on each of the speakers before they speak. Our first speaker is Colm Laighneach. Colm was an active member of the Republican movement. He spent many years as a political prisoner. He's an active member of the Peadar O'Donnell Social Republican Forum and a member of its steering committee. He's a member of CPI and an elected member of its National Executive Committee. He's been involved in many struggles in the Monaghan area, campaigning around All Ireland Public Health Service, Palestine and solidarity with Cuba. He has a long history and experience in the struggle against imperialism, Britain, USA and the EU. I actually should have introduced myself too, for those who don't know me. My name is Therese Maloney, also a member of CPI. So Colm, when you're ready, over to you.
Comrades, scarcely 100 years ago, after the overthrow of the fledgling Irish Republic and the defeat of the nascent democracy in Ireland, in the counter-revolution euphemistically known as the Irish Civil War, the violent consolidation of bourgeois imperial forces that gave us the reactionary states of Northern Ireland and the Irish Free State are asking us to join in a celebration of our own oppression, a celebration of imperialism's latest disguise, that is the Good Friday Pact. Joined by the international bourgeoisie, they are inviting us to celebrate 100 years of imperial-inspired division and distortion, where all notions of democracy itself are turned on their head. Despite the flag waving and the acclamations of peace, the celebration of the Good Friday Agreement should signal for the thinking masses the death of even the most timid assertion of the right of Irish people to sovereignty and democracy, and the achievement of yet another reactionary collaboration, this time enrolling the once uncompromising Republican movement, implacable in its assertions of the Irish right to national sovereignty and democracy, into an unholy and unlikely alliance comprising the imperial forces of Britain, Europe and the USA and the Irish bourgeoisie. Unprecedentedly in Irish history, the now reformed revolutionary Republican movement is enlisted in the celebration of imperialism and the occupation of Ireland. To all the world, it appears that the pacification of Ireland is complete. But comrades, we know the objective of British imperialism in Ireland has never been to deliver peace or democracy. As Queen Elizabeth I reminds us from more candid times, as she bemoaned the vigour of her soldiers when conquering Ireland, saying, I quote, "I find they've left me only bones to reign over." The imperial plan has always been to extract the wealth and the resources of Ireland in the interests of the British ruling class. For centuries, the heavy task of extracting and exploiting the material resources and labour of Ireland, as in other colonial possessions throughout the world, has led British imperialism to play fast and loose with the notion of democracy, and provided the oppressed masses of Ireland and elsewhere to suffer many distortions of humanity that they have described as democracy. In Ireland, we have suffered direct military subjugation, colonial settlerism, absorption into their United Kingdom, and finally apartheid partition in the name of peace and democracy. The Good Friday Pact heralds a new chapter in the same old book of protecting and disguising the interests of British ruling class as they update and manoeuvre in the face of demographic change and the concrete economic realities of the international nature of capitalist exploitation. The Good Friday Agreement represents nothing more than a move from open discriminatory apartheid to a new shared apartheid via the institutionalisation of sectarianism under British rule. All at once, the role of Britain in Ireland has been reformed from an historic colonial oppressor to a disinterested guarantor of peace and democracy and human rights, we are told. Comrades, history tells us the lofty task of bringing democracy to Ireland has been achieved by dint of coercion, discrimination, fostering sectarian division, with the occasional starvations thrown in as incentive. But primarily, the British ruling class has achieved and continues to achieve the conquest of Ireland through its military might and occupation. The constitutional position of Northern Ireland has not changed, and the North remains firmly in the hands of Britain until such times as Britain decides otherwise. If the Good Friday Agreement is about anything, it is about updating the colonial narrative in the hope to obscure the nature of colonialism itself. It claims that the people of Northern Ireland are sovereign and in control of their own destinies, and that imperialism has reformed itself and no longer has any selfish or strategic interest. It promises the oppressed nationalist community a pathway to unity while providing unionism a guarantee of ascendant privilege. As ever, imperialism is agile in line as it is in extracting. The Good Friday Pact serves to reinforce the imperial narrative veneer that seeks to disguise the imperial nature of British rule in Ireland. The narrative has never changed, presenting as it does Britain as an honest broker, attempting to civilise the savage Irish, and at all times trying to assuage the warring and innately sectarian tribes in Ireland from their congenital inability to live together. All this despite the fact that it is imperialism itself which has fostered these divisions by privileging a minority ascendancy above the majority in order to gain their loyalty and set them on the majority. 100 years ago, in the face of armed revolt, imperialism was forced to reconceive how it might control the forces and resources of Ireland. Consequently, Ireland was partitioned, and the apartheid identity of Northern Ireland created against all norms of democracy. Of course, 75 years of apartheid demanded ever increasing levels of suppression, leading to 30 years of armed struggle and a failed state. As what came to be known as the Irish peace process emerged, it appeared as though imperialism had been forced into negotiation and must inevitably lead to at least a more progressive reconfiguration and give way to some of recognition of the demand for Irish democracy, as this had been the central demand of Irish republicanism. Many believed that the British had been forced into negotiation by the length and ferocity of the resistance. Progressive forces throughout Ireland, including the Communist Party of Ireland, joined in the call for a negotiated peace on this basis. Such was the euphoria and deafening stage management of the process that only slowly did it become clear that what had been heralded as peace was nothing more than a highly choreographed and staged repackaging of the old imperial narrative of Britain as peacemaker between the warring tribes, and a sophisticated recalculation and realignment of the forces in Ireland in order to consolidate imperial power in the north and to anticipate and control any change that might result from the demographic decline of unionism as a majority in the north. Key to this was the enlisting of Irish nationalism and republicanism to an acceptance of British right to rule in Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement is predicated on the British assertion that it has no longer any strategic or selfish interest in Ireland. The British would like us to believe that they have forfeited the protection of their western flank in pursuit of democracy in Ireland. They would ask us to believe that they are no longer concerned with the controlling and shaping of the economic development of Ireland. They would ask us to believe that they are no longer concerned with maintaining the reserve labour force that the population of the north represents. They would tell you that the north of Ireland is a legacy they would gladly rid themselves of no benefit to them, a white man's burden. Of course, this is a lie. The military defence of the western borders alone makes the north of strategic value. Economically, their selfish interest is evidenced in their hard-fought and ongoing defence of the control of the northern economy in the recent Brexit negotiations. In classical imperialist mode, underdevelopment of the north continues apace with the extraction of capitalist rent for little return. The Good Friday Agreement demands the acceptance of Northern Ireland as a democratic entity, acceptance of all its armed and unarmed forces, the acceptance of the principle of unionist consent, the acceptance of the British established parameters to democracy in Ireland, the renunciation of armed struggle, the surrender of Articles 2 and 3 by the Irish government, the Southern government. In return, it provides an assembly modelled on the imperial narrative of sectarian difference, with no executive or fiscal power. In short, it demands a complete retraction of any definition of sovereignty or democracy in return for the opportunity to participate in a sectarian sham. The Good Friday Agreement does offer a vague promise of a referendum on Irish unity, to be conducted internally in the north and excluding the vast majority of the Irish electorate from any decision as to its own future. Further, the decision to hold any such referendum remains and will always remain the sole prerogative of the British Home Secretary, and furthermore, any decision on the result of the referendum remains wholly a decision for the British Parliament. In essence, by providing a veneer of power sharing in the form of institutionalised sectarianism and meaningless deference to Irish unity, Britain has disarmed its armed nemesis and incredibly enrolled them in the service of the state. The Good Friday Agreement secured the surrender of Articles 2 and 3 by the Southern government, the constitutional claim to Ireland as a whole, and the historic definition of sovereignty that had been an obstacle to the affirmation of the international community of the British presence in Ireland. In an apparent quid pro quo, the British revoked the Government of Ireland Act. However, it is not the Government of Ireland Act which underpins Britain's legal claim to Ireland. Rather, it is the Act of Union itself to which no change has been made. In securing acceptance for and definition for their definition of democracy in Ireland, the Good Friday Agreement represents the highest achievement of the highest form of capitalism in Ireland in its history, and has become a template for imperialism and counterinsurgency throughout the world. This achievement is not without cost to the working class, north and south, as the acquiescence of republicanism has led to a shift to the right in Irish politics in general, with Republicans moving to the centre, having previously held a general left position. We see the rise of the far right for the first time since the Blue Shirts. The move to the centre has left working class communities unrepresented and a ready prey for the right and the fascists. The Good Friday Agreement has further led to the assimilation and absorption of Irish political opinion into a blind acceptance of the European Union and the USA as paternal guarantors of democracy in Ireland, a decline in international solidarity as we are pulled into the imperialist sphere of influence. The mindset that is required to accept British rule further leads us to the general acceptance of the ceding of almost all executive power to the deeply undemocratic bourgeois alliance that is the European Union, and is conditioning the Irish people for participation in imperial war through the daily erosion of neutrality. The Good Friday Agreement cannot and will not deliver peace or democracy in Ireland, and is failing day by day and will continue to fail. The continuing stalemates that characterise political life in the north is a function of its sectarian structure that pits Catholic worker against Protestant counterpart in an endless search for the best share of the colonial patronage from London. The Good Friday Agreement has delivered for the population of the north, among other things, the worst health service in the United Kingdom, the lowest pay rates, a drastic reduction in the public services, including the provision of public housing, and the death by suicide and despair of a bigger number of people than died during the recent war. The Good Friday Agreement is not only an endorsement of partition and the sectarian construct, it serves primarily to stifle the development of class politics in Ireland and the necessary unity of workers in order to secure the most basic rights. It traps unionism in the mistaken and anachronistic belief of a return to ascendancy, and that the ascendancy and loyalty will give them privilege, while at the same time trapping nationalists in the futile pursuit of convincing unionists to surrender that ascendancy and privilege. The Good Friday Agreement, of course, is a pacification process, a long thought out and well rehearsed pacification process that involved the infiltration and manipulation of the conflict in Ireland to the conclusions that suited Britain. Arriving at this conclusion involved Britain in arming and directing not only its own forces, but also its loyalist surrogates and laterally the Republican resistance. It is as unscrupulous as it is violent and dangerous. The Good Friday Agreement is a snare and a delusion. It entangles us in a web of terms and conditions regarding Irish unity that only Britain can interpret and adjudicate. It invites the delusion British legislation will deliver the way to national democracy within an all-Ireland republic. A political outcome Britain has strenuously rejected and sabotaged at every opportunity in history. Comrades, it is as likely that British imperialism will reach for yet another distortion of history to satisfy its needs, with the likelihood of a return to Commonwealth or Union within NATO looming. Not content with having achieved the consolidation of the imperial narrative, the project is now the outlawing and the outcasting of all those opposing British pacification strategy. The imperial aim is not only to demonise and castigate anyone who avows the right to of the Irish people to sovereignty and democracy, but to put beyond the pale the very mention of democracy itself. This process entails the revising and distorting of Irish history to a retrospective glorification of the imperial past, and the acceptance of symbols, language and cultural domination. Thus, the once universally recognised slaughter of the innocent of the First World War becomes a glorious example of Irish bravery, and a simple plea for Irish neutrality and rejection of imperial war provokes attack from the media and accusations of treachery. Of course, we cannot and will not be silenced. The solution to imperialism is clear. The way to peace in Ireland is clear. As the architects of Irish democracy before us assessed, having examined the concrete realities and forces in Ireland, we must declare the right of the Irish people to the ownership of Ireland, to the unfettered control of Irish destinies, and to the unfettered control of Irish destinies to be sovereign and indefeasible. The long usurpation of that right through various treaties, disguises, including the Good Friday Agreement, cannot extinguish that right. Let us rally, let us tell the world that the Good Friday Agreement has not delivered peace, and that Ireland is not at peace, nor can it be at peace while British imperialism wages war against democracy in our country. Let us rally for peace, justice and democracy that only a socialist national democracy can deliver.
Thank you, Colm. Our next speaker is Tommy McKearney. Tommy is chair of the Peadar O'Donnell's Socialist Republican Forum and a member of its steering committee. Tommy was a long-time member of the Republican movement and spent 16 years in Laighneach prison camp. He also took part in the first hunger strike there in 1980. He spent a gruelling 53 days on hunger strike. He is and was a freelance journalist and a trade union activist. While in Laighneach, he founded the League of Communist Republicans. He has been, like most of his family, an active Republican all his life. Tommy has and remains a staunch anti-imperialist.
Thank you, Trace. I will stand up because then you can speak better from this. Colm has outlined the impact and the outworking of the Good Friday Agreement. What I would like to do now is point out why it came about, why imperialism found it necessary to bring it about, and what I want to do is, through a number of questions and observations, highlight what I'm saying. Now, there is a narrative, we're very familiar with the narrative that surrounds the Good Friday Agreement, which is determined to outline the narrative of what had happened for the last 30, 40, 50 years in the North. That, as Colm has pointed out to us, that what we were experiencing was a tribal warfare. Two tribes that couldn't live together, and the idea being promoted that thankfully, out of the benevolence and good nature of Britain, that it sent its troops in to keep the two warring factions apart. That is the received wisdom promoted by the British media, also promoted by the media south of the border and, of course, the north. This is the received wisdom that this is what was happening, and that peace, something called peace, came about as a result of the Good Friday Agreement. That almost as if this was some sort of feud that had broken out, and sensible men came along, sensible women came along with help from outside, from America, from Britain, from Dublin, to broker a peace settlement. Now, this I challenge, that it wasn't quite like that. A narrative promoted, as the narrative has been promoted, there's a reason and a rationale behind our narrative. On one hand, there is the rationale for telling the story as the narrator wishes to have it told. That's the first point. But secondly, it's to obliterate any alternative narrative. So I want to suggest an alternative narrative, not just to the received wisdom about this tribal warfare, which I suspect many in this audience, if not all of this audience, rejects. Something deeper than that. As Colm has outlined, it was something that happened by design. Now, we've been experiencing over the last couple of weeks this, if you like, almost an orgy of celebration of the Good Friday Agreement. We've seen Joe Biden come, didn't stay long, whistle-stop tour through the north. We've had the Clintons, we've had Tony Blair, all, as we would say, questionable people's commitment to peace. If you were to talk to the people of Iraq, Afghanistan, many other, Libya. But having said that, we've had the Blairs, the Clintons, we've had Bertie Ahern, all turning up, others as well. I would suggest that some missing person in all of this. We've had this Richie Sunak, we've had George Mitchell, but one key figure, in my opinion, key figure has been missing. We didn't see P. O'Neill. Now, for maybe if there is any of our younger listeners here, P. O'Neill effectively secretary to the Army Council of the Irish Republican Army. Now let me be a little bit facetious. If, having read the terms and conditions of the Good Friday Agreement, had P. O'Neill issued a statement saying bollocks, there would have been no Good Friday Agreement. We wouldn't have had any settlement whatsoever. Simple as all that. Now, whether that's right or whether it's wrong, whether it happened that way or not, but it's a fact of life that had P. O'Neill, and I'm talking here about the IRA, not agreed to the terms and conditions of the Good Friday Agreement, there would have been no agreement. Bono could have held up John Hume's hand and David Trimble's hand. He could have walked around the City Hall with them. Clinton could have danced around the City Hall in Belfast. There would have been no agreement. It's as simple as all that. The agreement came about as a result of negotiations, effectively to bring an end to the IRA campaign. That's effectively what was happening. Now, that is not the narrative that wishes that the British, the Free State government, let me still call them the Free State government, and its establishment, or the Americans wish to have portrayed. But without it, there would have been no agreement. Now let's just then look at what was happening, or what has been happening. We could have had an agreement between John Hume, David Trimble. It wouldn't have made any difference. Wouldn't have resolved the situation at all. We could have had the agreement of the Dublin government. Dublin government, SDLP, representing constitutional nationalism, unionism, effectively were no threat to imperialism, either British imperialism or wider imperialism, because they were on their side. But let's look at what was happening. For 25 to 30 years, there had been an armed conflict in the north. What effectively had happened was that after practically 2 centuries of Orange repression, the Catholic working class went to war against the British state. Now, the Orange state did not begin. Orange repression, the Orange state might have begun in 1922, 21, 22, but Orange repression began much earlier. Britain, the imperial power, has long experience of manipulation, divide and conquer. In the 1790s, Britain and its, if you like, what we might now call the deep state, British intelligence, whatever they were known as then, had an interest in controlling Ireland. And in 1795, if I'm not mistaken, 2 institutions were established. And I think it's important to think that these 2 institutions were not founded or created by Britain. They were already in existence, but Britain designed and used them to its own effect. One, 1785, the Catholic Church was granted Maynooth. That was 30 years before Catholic emancipation. And well, the Catholic Church has served reaction in this island ever since. 1785, in County Armagh, British intelligence took what was a riff-raff, rabble, become known as the Orange Order, and formed a very powerful force, a force that was used for the same reason Maynooth was granted its finances, was to counteract the impact of the democracy that was coming from France, the French Revolution. For the very same reason, the Orange Order was taken and empowered by British intelligence to prevent the democracy that was emerging from within the Presbyterian inspired United Irish movement. That division within the 6 counties existed. The repression of Orangism, as I said, didn't start in 1921, didn't start in 1922, it started then. Throughout the 1800s, there was consistent repression of the Catholic minority. Now, I'm using Catholic because there is no other term convenient for it. But it divided, conquered, and allowed Britain to rule through the 6 counties. South, not quite perfectly geographically speaking, but roughly speaking, beyond Ulster. What was happening was repression was conducted by the aristocracy backed by the RIC. But that armed resistance that broke out after almost 2 centuries of experience of repression, discrimination, mistreatment, maltreatment, the dam burst and there was an outburst of anger that resulted in an IRA campaign. Now, it was, as I've said, it was the Catholic working class effectively that was fighting this war. Now, I'm not saying, and I'll say this, it was not a socialist revolution, it was not class warfare, but it was a democratic upsurge. To what extent this was a mass movement, let me just say this, that through the course of 25 years of armed conflict, there was approximately 20 to 25,000 Republican prisoners. Think of that as a community. 500,000 Catholics in the north, not all working class, but 20,000 prisoners. A 25-year armed campaign against the British state maintained. 100,000 turned up to Bobby Sands' funeral. 30,000 plus voted for Bobby Sands in Fermanagh, South Tyrone. That certainly indicates a mass support, basic support, a mass movement. Was this understood or known to the British state? Of course they did. It's one thing what the British media will say, it's one thing what rabid Tory backbenchers will say from the House of Commons. But there is this, British intelligence will tell the Prime Minister what he or she has to know rather than what they would like to know. And they were telling the results of what was a well-known scoping exercise. They knew exactly how much support that armed campaign had. In the early 1970s, and I'll tell you just the extent of the scoping. You may have spotted or watched recently or over the last year or so a clip of the late Mark McGuinness in a car in Derry handing a small firearm to a young lad, talking about weapons in the back of the car. That film, that clip was shot way back in the early 70s. It was shot for a film to be delivered by a man called J. Boyer Bell, author of a book on the IRA and trusted by the IRA. J. Boyer Bell visited Derry, he visited Belfast, he visited Tyrone, Armagh, Derry County. He and his team built up a very comprehensive understanding of the support, not necessarily where the weapons were stored, because that wasn't important, scoping the support that that movement had. J. Boyer Bell, in his later years, delivered a series of lectures in Laighneach, Virginia, to a group of activists, political activists, reactionaries there, and I assume you're aware of where Laighneach, Virginia is. That's the headquarters of the CIA. The man who was producing the film for J. Boyer Bell was a freelance agent from Mossad. Now, I'm not creating those figures because I've been interviewed by BBC about that, so it's a fact. So that's just one example of the scoping exercise being carried out on behalf of the British. The British knew what they were dealing with and were concerned about the extent of the insurrection. The British, in dealing with the problem in the north, were aware of a strategic dilemma they were faced with. The strategic dilemma was this: they could potentially contain the IRA's armed campaign indefinitely. They were able to do that. They could contain it indefinitely. But you're dealing not with, bear in mind, a finite number of armed men. You're dealing with a population, and that's qualitatively different. But consider that they were at best able to potentially contain the campaign. Their real concern wasn't so much containing an armed group of men. It was the fact that they were dealing with a deeply alienated population. Deeply alienated population. the extent to which they were quite aware. But also, let's keep in mind that if anybody understands Ireland, and I would suggest that from time to time, British intelligence, the British deep state, understands what happens in Ireland better maybe than many of us on this side of the water does. They knew very well, and perfectly well, they were aware of Irish history and that of its militant armed groups. The current, not so much the groups, but also the current of armed resistance. Two things in particular would have concerned them. A, the likelihood of generational change of leadership, direction in the Republican movement, and secondly, a distinct possibility that a review of the value of armed insurrection might see it replaced by social agitation. As had happened with the collapse of the Fenian revolt when it turned into Laighneach. As a result of the losing of when the Republic was overthrown in 23, there emerged then the powerful movement within the Republican Congress. The Republican Congress, short-lived, or that it may have been, but bear in mind that it wasn't just concentrating on housing, it was also land annuities, which were taken over also by Fianna Fáil and De Valera. But the current that is Irish armed militant republicanism. Republicanism has many definitions. It can be defined in so many different ways, and it has to be qualified to give it to let us know where it stands. It can range from the Republic of Apartheid South Africa to the People's Republic of China, and you can guess there's a vast difference. For that reason, the great Connolly talked of a workers' republic. Now, these were concerns that Britain was well aware of. These were currencies, trends. Armed insurrectionary republicanism, in many ways, is a phenomenon as distinct from a pure philosophy. It's a phenomenon where the dispossessed, the harassed, the oppressed, the rejected resort to arms. They've done it with the United Irishmen, they've done it with the Fenians, they've done it in the 1920s, and again in the 1970s and 80s. It can change. It does change. And let's then put it into the precise context. In 1981, the militant Irish Republican movement was reviewing its options post the 1981 hunger strike. There was at least three currents within that movement. One was the old, if you like, Fenian dynamiters. Not going to name names, but they were content, determined to maintain an armed campaign with little else. There was another current, which was the prevailing current, that argued for effectively an electoral strategy. There was, however, a third current, and that was advocating deploying the newly activated support base into organised labour and declaring for a workers' republic. This latter scenario, if enacted, was enough to disturb not only the British, but also the Southern Irish bourgeoisie, and naturally enough, imperialism's overseer in Washington. Let's just reflect for a second. 1980-81, a support base had emerged. It was obvious. I've referred to the fact that those 30,000 people voted for Bobby Sands and for Fermanagh South Tyrone. 100,000 turned out for his funeral. Many thousands, and let's be honest about it, were beaten off the street in front of the British Embassy in Dublin. The wisdom coming from Dublin here at the moment is that the Gardaí were attacked. It was a venomous attack. That's not the narrative that was told from the north. But let's just think for a moment that had, instead of the concentration being on an armed campaign, had an armed campaign been put into abeyance, had electoralism been put on the shelf instead of becoming the main theme, had it involved social agitation, had that 50, 60,000 people that were active on the streets. Bear in mind, we're talking about a lot of young people, a lot of active people, and for the first time emerging, a lot of young women. Had they formed a trade union, 50, 60,000 strong trade union, which was quite possible. On the one hand, you might say, could they have got a licensed trade union? If you have 50, 60,000 workers in a trade union, you might not need a license. But of course, having said all that, it was possible to access a license. Just a matter of interest. Through the 1980s, the General Secretary of one of the most active unions in the Republic was a regular visitor to Laighneach. I can fill you in the details if you like some other time. But that was something that the British state, the deep state, was quite well aware of. Now, could you imagine what would have happened had that emerged instead of an armed campaign, instead of an electoralist campaign, had it emerged that way? Could you imagine a movement of that description even today? Could you imagine what would happen if Laighneach was quoting a powerful movement in Ireland? How disturbed the British establishment would be. Could you imagine how disturbed Leo Varadkar and Mixie Martin would be? Could you imagine then what would happen? Because we're talking here about wide influences. Ursula von der Leyen, apparently according to McKearney, has recently complimented Ireland on how it has been a small country prospering within the larger union. Could you imagine, had there been a movement, a powerful trade union movement in Ireland that had set up in the 1980s not only industrial union but a community union? Could you imagine that union then empowering the campaign Families Against Drugs, Families Against Landlords, Families Against Private Health? It would be a frightening prospect for the establishment, North and South. It would be a frightening prospect for the establishment in Britain, in the European Union, and in the United States of America. The fact is that we're talking here about possibilities, questions. Certainly we can take it for granted that the British were aware of what was happening. And had that electoral strategy that was pursued, and it has been pursued, had it failed, and with the historical Republican suspicion of parliamentary politics, that alternative strategy may well have found favour under a new generation. Keep in mind that there has been frequently generational change within the Republican current. There was a generational change in 1986 that could well have been another one 10 or 15 years later had it not been succeeding. And that, coupled with the knowledge of inexorable demographic change in the North. So we're looking at two situations here. There is well-known fact, as we've seen recently emerge in the recent census in the North, the demographics have changed. Now, we can't extrapolate, because it's not to say that every Roman Catholic would vote for United Ireland, would vote for a republic, would even vote for, never mind, a socialist republic. But keep in mind that there was that mass movement in the North, 25 years of resistance, demonstrated on the streets, impacting into the republic as well. Keep in mind that with the demographic change, that there was an inexorable, there was an inevitability about change coming about. Now, the British state does not necessarily look into crystal balls, it looks at scenarios. What happens if this is working? What happens if that's working? What happens if something else? But it will always take consideration of the possibility of the worst case scenario, which from their point of view would have been the emergence of a strong working class organised labour movement. And just as earlier generation of imperialists had accepted the need to make carefully measured concessions to Irish nationalism, and I use the word nationalism consciously, in 1922, in order not to be faced with something much more radical. Now, again, I'm going back to the 1920s, 21, 22. The British have a long, long history of dealing with empire. There's probably no country in the world has more experience in dealing with empire and the retreat from empire and managing the retreat from empire and transferring empire of the old style into the neo-colonialism of new imperialism. There is, and I mean, not for 1 second would I undermine the contribution of the West Cork Brigade of the IRA in 1920, Tom Barry and his flying column. But put it this way, the West Cork flying column, and fair play to them, took on the auxiliaries at Kilmichael. They shot 18 auxiliaries dead. Also, having said that, at the time there was about 18 Soviets set up, had been set up across Ireland, mostly in the south, but there had been in Monaghan, to Limerick, actually there was one in Bury, home of the notorious leader of Fianna Fáil. The Irish Times was lamenting at that period that Ireland was on the verge of a Bolshevik takeover. Now, we know that the Irish Times is prone to panic, but there was good reason. With 15 to 16 Soviets, workers' takeovers in those years, there was movement to take land back from the landed aristocracy. This was social and economic revolution on the move. Concession was made. The question I would ask was, to what extent was it as a result of purely an IRA armed campaign, or was it to make a concession before the Bolshevik menace, as they would have seen it, arrived, unstoppable? That, keep in mind, when we talk about Peadar O'Donnell had run up a red flag over the mental hospital in Monaghan. But not only that, Peadar O'Donnell then, after he left and set up a Soviet in Monaghan, Peadar O'Donnell went down to Caledon. Now Caledon become almost infamous in more recent times for the squatting in Caledon. But Caledon is a predominantly unionist area. Peadar O'Donnell led the workforce that had been working in the mills around Caledon on a massive strike, to such an extent that on one occasion he led a procession of workers, from the striking workers, through Caledon, a small village, led by the Orange Band, and Peadar O'Donnell carrying a red flag out in front of an orange band. Now just think of that. It's amusing for me to think of that happening in Caledon, to be honest, but think of the impact of that. Think of the impact of the Soviet in Limerick, the Soviet Cork Harbour. These are facts that the British state had to be aware of. Roll forward 100 years, were they also concerned about something similar happening? So, building on its vast experience of managing retreat from empire while embarking on promoting a neo-colonialist programme, Britain supported the development of a process of engagement with and encouragement for the Republican movement's electoralist wing. Now, electoral success depends on a lot of things, but what it cannot, electoralism under conventional conditions, electoralism cannot survive with an Armalite in one hand and a ballot box in the other hand. Cannot. We have seen, even within the last few days, the scurrilous attack on the Sinn Féin party as a result of allegedly receiving a relatively small sum of money from an ex-Sinn Féin councillor. Now, that's only a small sample of how the propaganda machine works. It's not feasible to be in constitutional electoral politics and have an armed campaign running at the same time. So, focusing and concentrating on an electoralist strategy means the end, one, of an armed campaign, which, and I'm not advocating it or anything else, I have been there in the past, but I'm saying that that's the practical result of it, on one hand. But secondly, electoralism and elections are fought usually in what's known in certain circles as triangulation. You win an election by winning over the middle ground. You don't win an election usually in these conditions when you're dealing with a state-controlled media, when you're talking about a printed media that's controlled by big business. You do not win the hearts and minds of the population by preaching anything other than centralist, middle-of-the-road politics. Just a small thing I read within the last couple of days, an article in the Morning Star. And I thought it was interesting. This was an article about creating a new workers' party, and they were actually arguing against the feasibility of it, but they were saying, the Labour Party has survived until now at any rate, this is the British Labour Party, because electoralism functions as glue that holds entirely disparate ideological positions in the same organisation, because that organisation can deliver seats in the Westminster Parliament, in devolved parliaments and council chambers. Effectively, if ever there was a critique or criticism of electoralism, that's it. It's there to hold together the middle ground, the left as well. It's not there to deliver radical change. This was, in fact, the need to bring about an agreement with P. O'Neill. He wasn't there at the celebrations because the narrative couldn't afford to recognise or accept or identify the position or why the agreement was so necessary for colonialism, for imperialism, that the risk of it escalating beyond their control. It's one thing to control an armed campaign, an armed insurrection with small forces. It's another thing to control and manipulate a population that's committed to resistance. It would have been virtually impossible to control the outcome of a mass social agitational movement focused and geared and directed under a new form of trade unionism. The nightmare from the British point of view was again to go back to what had happened in 1916 with James Connolly. There the power of organised labour combined with militant Irish republicanism creates a very difficult force to stop, focusing on social economic agitation. So bear in mind that the Good Friday Agreement did not come simply on that day in 1998. Its origins came much earlier, when there was a focus and an encouragement put behind an electoralist strategy. We don't have to talk about traitors, which is a fallacy. We're talking about identifying those that the British could deal with, and for that reason so much support was given to implementing the agreement in 1998. Think for a moment, would the President of the United States and his wife come visiting the Prime Minister of Britain, Taoiseach from Southern Ireland? Why would such powerful forces come to secure a simple agreement in the 6 counties if there wasn't something greater at stake? It doesn't really make sense, or does it? So, what my argument is that the Good Friday Agreement was not so much a peace process as a transformation programme designed in many ways to update the Treaty of 1922 and ensure that into future Ireland, that it would remain within the orbit and zone of Western imperialism. And that's what I would suggest we think about and consider what options can be employed to transform this society in a way that we would suggest would counter the appalling conditions we experience north and south. The one and only. There's only one genuine solution, and that's one that was promoted by James Connolly over 100 years ago. It's a workers' republic, because nothing short of a workers' republic will deliver, and it won't certainly be delivered to the Good Friday Agreement. So, Gura Míle Maith.
Thank you to both Colm and Tommy for the